The Winter Olympics in Beijing are set to begin next Friday, February 4th. It's a good time to check in with Brock University professor Michael Naraine from their Department of Sport Management. Michael, these are probably the most controversial Olympics, what would you say, since LA in 1984?
Probably since Tokyo 2021.
Good point, good point.
But it has been a controversial game simply because it's not just another pandemic games. It's also China's increasing geopolitical influence in the world. And so, we saw this back in 2008 when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympic Games. That was truly their coming out party. Now this is sort of round two, and things have, over this past decade plus, have exponentially increased in terms of China's influence. They're trying to control different parts and regions of the world. I think when we talk about it's a sporting event, it's more than that for the Chinese, and that's why we're seeing this particular games really push through when, again, these questions about whether or not these games should take place are rearing their ugly head.
There was some talk that maybe Canada, maybe the US should have boycotted these games, and they did not. The NHL decided not to send their players. That was probably more for COVID safety reasons than it was for any political reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. In the case of the NHL not wanting to send their players, what we have to understand there is the Chinese have very strict quarantine laws. And if, unfortunately, one of the NHL athletes had contracted the virus, they would essentially be landlocked into Beijing for about 15 days. And that, given the tight NHL scheduling window, that was not going to be possible for the NHL to kind of work with. In terms of, an actual boycott, yeah, that was one of those things that was, floated early on. But as we've learned from the 1980s experiments, both with Moscow and with LA, boycotting an Olympic Games truly hurts the athletes and the athletes alone. Diplomatic boycotts, which are what is being implemented by many of these Western nations, will be more effective because you're not sort of celebrating the party that the host nation wants to put on, and you're not sort of giving them that cachet and that influence. However, a full-out boycott would not be useful, and that's obviously why we're not seeing it this time around in 2022.
Do you believe that the athletes will be safe in the Olympic Village this year? And, as an athlete, you train so long for this goal. How can you not go because of the fear of COVID?
Yeah, and that's truly the dynamic, that balancing act here is, for a lot of these, elite athletes, they've been training their whole lives for this moment, or certainly even the last decade at least, and for many of these Canadian athletes in particular, these are the athletes who saw Vancouver 2010, when they were young and were like, I want to do this when I'm, 22, 24, 25, et cetera, and when I'm in the prime of my athletic career. And so, this is really hard for Canadian athletes in particular because of that whole narrative, starting with Vancouver 2010 and now culminating here in Beijing 2022. To go back to the earlier question, do I think the athletes will be safe? I think they'll be relatively safe. We saw this in Tokyo 2021, which is where, some athletes did contract the virus, but it wasn't a large swath. Is it going to be an experience like a games, like the Beijing 2008 games? Is it going to be an experience like, even Pyeongchang 2018? Probably not. It's not going to be that fun party-like atmosphere where athletes get to not only demonstrate their talents on the world stage, but to culturally connect and exchange with other athletes. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Olympic Games, having been in a village myself, is seeing all of the different nations, all of the different friendships that are created, the sharing of pins, breaking bread with someone else from a different country and a different culture. That's one of the best things about the Olympic movement. And unfortunately, that's not going to be able to happen. The plexiglass, the mask wearing, that's just going to be more, restrictive and prohibitive of those cultural and social exchanges. And so, do I think the athletes will be ultimately safe? Yes, to maybe not to a full 100% capacity, but the IOC has learned from the Tokyo experiment. And the Chinese organizing committee have even further measures that are perhaps even more stringent and more prohibitive, we'll call it that, than the Japanese organizers. And so I do think that the vast majority of athletes will be safe, but it certainly won't be necessarily an enjoyable experience like past games before it.